the newsagents.
This is the calm before the storm, this.
Calm before the storm,
Yeah,
what do you mean?
this is now compared to what it'll get like. If more trouble comes coming here, the locals won't put up for much longer, even the Englishmen. No one's going to put up for much longer. I want like as soon as the lights go on, the sun goes down. It's all bollocks. Says you. Yeah, so you're an immigrant believer then, yeah?
I am.
Oh, yeah. Right, go and pray to a mosque.
I have to live in my house in fear because I'd rather pay for them dirty, scummy to be in there than protect the English.
Why do you think they're dirty?
Why do I think they're dirty?
Yeah.
Look at where they've come from. They come here to get more money, to do what they want. They don't have to go to work. They get benefits. They get houses. They get nothing. And they look and stay at what they're living in.
That was a woman we met back in February last year, attending a far-right rally, borderline riot, outside of the very same Rotherham Holiday Inn, which was nearly burned down, asylum seekers and all, inside at the height of this last week's unrest. That woman, who brought her kids to that event, shocked me then, and in some ways it shocks me even more now. Not just because, as we were saying at the time, the far right was clearly growing in reach and scale, but also, of course, because of the sheer bile and hate that she had. I remember thinking then, as I think now, for her, a woman in her 20s or early 30s, with her two kids there with her, screaming about paedophiles and Muslims with a roar and a rage which could not be false. How did it come to that? What led her to that moment? There's been so much blithe talk this week about the far right, which assumes a lot of knowledge. So hopefully, at the unrest end, or if things go wrong, while it catches its breath, we wanted to answer that question. What is it that leads people to the far right? What even is the far right in Britain in 2024? Who are they? And what role does that Pied Piper of politics, Tommy Robinson, play? Why is he their talisman? And what might they do next? It's Lewis here. Welcome to the Newsagents.
Men will rise up. We're always going to rise up. They have to rise up to defend their families. You've brought this war on our shores. You've brought danger on our shores. You cowards. So that anger you're seeing, and that's just before people condemn them, yeah? Don't call them hooligans. They're justified in their anger. Yes, there's a better way to do it, but they don't see no better way. Because you know what? The government have told them we only listen to rioters, we listen to violence. That's the message that's been sent by these in control.
That is a voice you might not have heard. To be honest, if you haven't, you're lucky. But is, unfortunately, nonetheless, an increasingly important one in our politics. It's Tommy Robinson, or Stephen Yaxley Lennon, to give his actual name. He's become an iconic figure for the British far right. In many ways, he's been the spiritual and intellectual force behind the events of the last week, albeit from afar, tweeting with abandon from the comfort of his Greek holiday. His tweets, with his 900,000 followers, are often egregiously offensive, talking about other things of Mohammeds for Muslims and the rest, and have, according to Tortoise, been seen 1.2 billion times in the 3 months to August, with 4.5 million visiting his profile. That has had a normalising effect on his views because they are seen and disseminated so widely, and they show up, as we will see, in some very ostensibly mainstream places and from the lips of what should be ostensibly mainstream voices. Later in the show, we're going to be talking to someone who worked very closely with Tommy Robinson to get a sense of how it can be that you are pulled into that world and what he wants to achieve. But first, as we say, we wanted to zoom out a bit and try and answer that question. When we talk about the far right and those on the streets this week, who are they? Where do they come from? So we're joined now by Joe Mulhall, who's the Director of Research for Hope Not Hate, who, if you're a long-time listener to the podcast, and of course most of you will know that we've done some work with them before on this exact issue around the growth of the far right. Joe, we've been talking like all week now, ever since this started, about the far right. And we talk about them. And of course, the term far right has very particular connotations in a lot of people's minds, and they think of kind of historic examples of the European far right, obviously, and slightly weird men in slightly weird uniforms sort of doing their thing. Obviously, it's different in Britain in the modern age. Who are we talking about? When we talk about the far right in 2024, who are they? Where do they come from? What do they believe?
So
I think this kind of wave of far-right violence we've seen over the last 10 days now actually is a good example of what the modern far-right looks like in Britain. Yes, we have traditional fascist and far-right organisations that you're kind of talking about, you know, a leader, a structure, a branch structure, a membership list, maybe even a uniform. But actually, in and around those groups, which are generally tiny in the UK, we have these vast post-organisational networks, and by that I mean thousands of individuals that are either creating far-right content or consuming far-right content outside of any formal structure. Outside, they're not a member of an organisation, they don't have a formal leader, but they're in these online spaces, and there are figureheads in those spaces. Tommy Robinson would be the most obvious example, and these individuals like the weather makers for these networks. And so what we've seen in the last 10 days is no central organisation, no single group has said, let's have a demonstration in all of these places at the same time. But individuals who are primarily local to a certain area, who are part of these networks, are then going and creating their own event. And so really it's much more decentralised than, say, when we were talking about the British National Party or the National Front or even the English Defence League, which was kind of erroneously discussed in the last 10 days or so. It's decentralised and it's locally led, but there's commonalities. If you look at the chants at each of these demonstrations or riots, if you look at the posters, if you look at the kind of iconography, if you look at the banners, if you look at what everyone's saying, there's a commonality, and that's because the people both who are attending them but also organising them are part of these sorts of online far-right networks.
And is it possible to talk about any kind of common belief structure? In the sense that it was easier, you've already alluded to it, when the British far right was slightly more coherent or organised, in the sense there was a party and that would have a platform, would even have a manifesto in the case of like the BNP. But as you say, this is a much more sort of diffuse network of people. Is it possible to talk about their beliefs and what they believe, if indeed they believe anything?
Yeah, there is. I mean, there's kind of less kind of old direct ideology, if you will, as you say. You know, there's like ideologues that were creating books and manifestos, etc. But certainly after the first riot on the Tuesday in Southport, it broadened out to basically cover the main issues with which the contemporary far right care about, and that is anti-Islam, anti-Muslim, anti-asylum seeker. But the really growing narrative amongst all of them is this idea that there has been a complete crisis or failure of multiculturalism. It's an ideology by opposition, if you will. You know, they're not necessarily talking about what the world should look like, but they're all having a commonality between them about what the crisis is and what the problem is, and that is not too many non-white people, white people being replaced, Islam being too strong, too many Muslims, and multiculturalism not working.
It's even more specific than that, isn't it, in the sense that what you see a lot of online, and if you talk to these people, it's a kind of sense of Armageddon, right? Like it's a sense, it's almost a kind of millennialist kind of tone to the politics, like in the sense that they believe that there is something so incompatible, particularly about Islam, with Western civilization, that having Muslims in the country will somehow bring about the fall of Western civilization itself.
Yeah, and you can kind of split it. The more extreme ends of the far-right movement, it's about race. It's about, you know, races are incompatible. The more moderate, if that's the right term, of
it's all racist.
Yeah, it's all still racist. Is as a cultural concern, and what you see is this word incompatibility is the right one to use. And so this idea that either different cultures or different races are completely incompatible is the first step. And then you have two sides to it. Some people say that that will inevitably bring about some form of civil war or mass disturbances and civil war. And then on the more extreme end, that's a desirable civil war.
And that was the language, of course, that we saw Elon Musk use.
Exactly right. And I know we've talked about it before on this podcast, about how it's quite easy to talk about specific far-right figures like Tommy Robinson, the role that they're playing, and that is important. But when this misinformation and disinformation spread in the last week about Muslims and Islam, there's a reason that so many people believe it, and part of that is because of these much more mainstream actors, whether or not it's Elon Musk, or whether or not it's elements of the media, or whether or not it's the fact that for years now in Britain we've talked about Muslims and asylum seekers in really dangerous ways, not least in our own parliament with people like Suella Braverman talking about invasion. The far right might create some of the misinformation and disseminate it, but if we want to understand why these people are believing it, and when this horrifying attack happens in Southport, why it is that people gather outside mosques, why it is that people try to burn down an asylum seekers hotel, it's because they were already inculcated with a kind of prejudice and a discrimination and a tendency to dislike those communities.
Do we have any idea about their numbers? Because obviously it's looked like there's loads of people in the last week, but obviously there aren't been that many people on the streets in the grand scheme of things. Do we have any idea how many people we might be talking about?
Look, it's really hard to put a specific number on it. Some of the places we've seen large mobilisations in their thousands, and I think partly because of this decentralised networks that I'm talking about, people have often focused on how many people are in a far-right group like Patriotic Alternative or Britain First, and these groups are tiny. But there are thousands and thousands of individuals who have both been clearly consuming far-right material and obviously acting in a far-right way. And by that I mean many of the people on these demonstrations, riots, protests and attacks would say that they're not far-right. But by the very fact that they're standing outside a mosque throwing a brick, they're engaging in far-right activism. And so you can turn around and say there's X amount of people in these particular organisations, but what we're dealing with here is a much, much larger set of individuals with varying levels of degrees of extremeness. And that does run into the thousands, and we've seen thousands on the streets. I would argue that it's probably the most widespread period of far-right violence of the post-war period. There's been specific examples of larger single events, but in terms of the amount of widespread events simultaneously happening in so many places, it's probably the biggest of the post-war period. And so we're talking thousands of individuals.
But doesn't that go back to, I mean, you just said there, you put your finger on it, I think, you just said that and I know this myself, having spoken to them this week, they will say they're not far right. They will say that their belief about the incompatibility of Islam and Muslims being in the country and Western values and Western civilization, they would claim that that was a moderate view or a self-evident view. But in a way, I mean, to exactly go back to your previous point, isn't the point that that is a view, in fairness, which more mainstream right-wing commentators, some politicians, would also say, or at least get close to the idea. They would say that we have a fundamental problem with Islam in this country for precisely that reason. So, in a way, I mean, it is true to say that the ideological terrain has moved in their direction, at least to some extent.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the thing is that the definitions of what is far right, what is radical right, what is extreme far right, they don't change in many ways. So there's lots of discussion about the exact wording, but they've changed the same. But what we've seen is more people cross the line into that form of politics. And so you often hear people saying, well, I can't be far right. I'm saying the same thing as Elon Musk, or I'm saying the same thing as our Home Secretary. As such, the far right is just these small little groups of skinheads on the fringe of our society. The far right isn't a tumour that hangs off our body politic, and if we just lop it off, the body's fine. It's an infection within it. And actually, the problem is that more and more people are crossing the line into any normal or accepted definition of what is radical right or far right politics. And so people say, I'm not far right, despite the fact people who've said that who have been stood outside a mosque protesting or protesting or trying to burn down asylum seeker accommodation. Part of the reason we need to reconceptualise what the far right is because people say, I'm not far right, I'm not a member of anything. But clearly in the digital age, you can consume far-right material, propagate far-right material yourself, and engage in far-right activism without being part of any organisation, without having a badge or a membership number.
How important would you say, you mentioned him already, and with the caveat that, as you say, this is a sort of diffuse network, but how important would you say that Tommy Robinson, or Stephen Yaxley Lennon, as his proper name, is in terms of the modern British far-right?
He's fundamentally central to it. I mean, just several days before that horrifying attack in Southport, Stephen Lennon had a demonstration in London, in Trafalgar Square, which had 20, maybe even 30,000 people on it, which is the largest kind of far-right gathering in decades and decades in the UK. When I talk about these decentralised networks, while it's like a school of fish, there are weather makers or kind of figures that are like influencers that direct these networks, and he's the most important. He's an individual that has the ability, during the last 10 days, he's promoted certain events which resulted in really extreme far-right violence, but he's also one of those figures that has created the climate out of which this violence has emerged. He's by some margin the best known far-right figure in the UK right now, and has been for a long time, and he's a big figure on the international scene. And I think that's why it makes it so scary that people like Elon Musk are interacting with someone like Stephen Lennon. When Stephen Lennon's activism, we are seeing the reality of what that looks like. His politics manifest on our streets, and we've seen that in attacks and violence and really horrifying scenes.
And just for people who aren't familiar, because he is still, for most people in Britain, a fringe figure, probably never heard of him, but for people who aren't familiar with him, could you just explain who he is and why he's become so important?
Yeah, so Stephen Lennon, or Tommy Robinson, started off as the founder and leader of the English Defence League in 2009. He was, he was the central driving force behind that organisation, which wrought havoc across our country for a number of years with really extraordinarily dangerous demonstrations. He then leaves in 2013. He then, for a long period of time, sets up various organisations that don't get a huge amount of traction, and then he continues to be a relatively well-known figure internationally. But he's deplatformed then towards 2017-18, and he loses his voice on most of the major social media platforms.
Because what he was saying was so
Because
extreme.
what he was saying was breaking their terms of service and was too extreme. And of course, he then disappears into the wilderness for a range of reasons, including personal and legal. But in recent years or so, Elon Musk has given him back his Twitter account, which now reaches tens of millions of people every week. And we've seen him once again re-emerge as a major figure in the UK in terms of the ability to mobilise tens of thousands of people in the UK. And that wasn't possible when he wasn't on those major social media platforms.
And why do you think it is that he's so talismanic for these people?
He's extraordinarily good at taking the whole range of very complex and difficult issues. There's lots of people in this country that are angry about a whole range of issues, many of which are legitimate. It doesn't legitimise the things we've seen in the last week. But, whether or not the status quo is not working for many people in this country. Politics is not meeting the material needs for their lives. And he provides a very simple monocausal explanation for why that is. And he turns around and says it's because of asylum seekers and it's because of Muslims. And for some people, that's a very appealing message. He also has a kind of personal charisma, and he's been doing it for so long. And as a result of it, he's also made millions of pounds himself. But I think it's that ability to create really simple answers to very complex questions that's made him so appealing.
Just finally, in terms of what happens next, remains to be seen whether there is more violence over the course of the weekend. People listening to this might know the answer to that by the time they are. But in terms of the future, looking further forward, what do you think the future is for the British far right? And what should we be thinking about? Decent, moderate politicians from the left and right, centre left and centre right. What should we be thinking about in terms of arresting their growth?
I think there's a couple of things here. And when I talk about these big networks, Tommy Robinson's a great example. When he's back online in these big spaces, the impact they can have. And I think we need to be asking serious questions about the social media platforms' role in this. And I think there's going to be an awful lot to come, discussions around the online safety bill and how effective that has been. But in the longer term, the real question is about social cohesion. Social cohesion is something that dropped off the agenda under Gove and under the recent Conservative governments. Multiculturalism is a wonderful thing. It works, but it takes work to make it work. And I think that there needs to be under the new government, some serious discussions about what does a really new, far-reaching social cohesion strategy look like. And the reason that we see these events kicking off is because they're taking hold in communities that are divided. And I think we have to engage with the communities that are susceptible to far-right politics if we're actually going to undermine figures like Tommy Robinson who are seeking to whip them up into this sort of anger.
Caolan Robertson is one of the few who can say he knows the mind of the extremist, of the far right, because he used to be one with that mind, used to have its reflexes, its assumptions, its fetid thoughts. As you'll hear, he has a remarkable story. I don't want to give it away, but it led him to some dark places. And when he emerged, he said it was like leaving a cult. While he was there, he became very close with Tommy Robinson, charged with doing his video work, social media, and so on. Few can know him better. He now works, among other things, for Byline Times, where he says he wants to help diffuse extremism and fake news. So, Caolan, first of all, thanks so much for doing this. And I suppose we should just start by, introducing yourself really to the audience. Tell us a little bit about your early life and kind of your journey, I suppose, into, well, a pretty extreme end of politics.
Well, I guess in 2016, I was growing up in London. I never really was engaged in politics. I saw what happened with the Orlando shooting, which was the worst shooting in American history. 50 gay people were killed in a nightclub by an Islamist. And I wanted to know why that happened. And I typed into YouTube the Orlando shooting. I tried to find answers on the internet because I grew up on the internet as a young kid. And most of the results that appeared were things like Rebel Media, Milo Yiannopoulos, right-wing results, Gavin McInnes saying this is because of the Quran. And I guess I started watching a lot of those videos and resonating with a lot of it and feeling like the media hadn't covered why these things were happening so much in Europe and America. And sympathizing a lot with right-wing politics. So I became a presenter at Rebel Media, and I became a colleague of Tommy Robinson for about a year, and became totally engrossed in right-wing media since that moment. And it wasn't until I realized that the people I was surrounded by weren't really at their core and at their heart about free speech that I left. Yeah, it was basically because of like unanswered questions and because of what I saw happening around me. And I guess I became someone that was totally radicalized for a couple of years.
And did that process happen slowly? Were people sort of guiding you through it? Was it largely kind of autodidactic? You were sort of teaching yourself through it? Like, how does that, I mean, you just use that word radicalize or radicalization. I mean, how does that happen in practice?
In quite small steps. You know, it starts with watching a video talking about how Islam is responsible for literature that might inspire a shooting at a women's concert or an LGBT concert. And then you watch one video like that, and then you get recommended a million more talking about how actually feminism has failed, or actually even more extreme stuff about how sort of white people are being replaced in Europe. And you get sent emails from YouTube. And as someone that actually grew up on the internet, like I've always got my news from YouTube, from Twitter, from like the actual news feeds. I remember distinctly like my news feeds becoming much more politicized and much more right wing as soon as I started consuming portions of that content. And I guess as soon as I started following more of it and started believing more of it, as soon as I remember starting to believe that Islam was like this hateful, messed up ideology, as soon as I started thinking that, you know, immigration was totally out of control, I was recommended a million more videos like that. And I had normal friends in my life. Yeah, I guess normal people started not associating with me anymore because I would start like spouting more right-wing views or more crazy views. I basically like entered an echo chamber. I stopped understanding what was even real anymore. It kind of got my back up much more because as soon as people stop talking to you when you have certain views, you double down even more, you watch even more videos. I guess since the Orlando shooting and since I started searching all this stuff and since I started getting recommended all those videos, I became completely obsessed with it. And I remember when Trump's inauguration happened, January 2017, there was a huge protest in London and I went to it and I watched a million videos from the US of people going to like left-wing protests and like wrecking feminists and like wrecking left-wingers. Like no one had done content like that in the UK before, and I felt like it was super unjust, and the media in the UK was completely controlled by the left and it needed some balance. So I went and interviewed a bunch of leftists there at the anti-Trump rally, and the video took off. Like the next day it had millions of views. Farage was sharing it. I got hired by Rebel Media as a presenter. I became like basically at the center of the world that I'd been watching for the last 6 months. And
you were getting presumably a lot of validation from that, and it became a kind of self-reinforcing thing.
Yeah, but like I genuinely felt like what I was doing was right. I felt like it was the truth. I felt like I was like pushing free speech in a country where you couldn't say anything anymore. I felt like genuinely Islam was a threat to LGBT rights, to women's rights. I felt like I was doing all this from like a progressive standpoint. But I guess over time, normal people stopped talking to me, and I started hanging out with people that were more and more involved in the hard right and started to sympathize with all the stuff they were saying. And I eventually became much more extreme than I ever like imagined. I started believing in insane conspiracy theories and even became like homophobic myself.
What sort of conspiracy theories? So you said you ended up believing really crazy stuff. Like what did you believe?
Well, I guess when I started like taking off, Tommy Robinson and I, he was hired by Rebel at the same time as me, and we started presenting a lot of videos together in London, and they were taken off fully. And the both of us started believing in things like the Great Replacement theory and like that white people in Europe were intentionally being replaced, that Jewish people were doing this. Like there was a lot of stuff that started appearing on our news feeds that felt completely unhinged, and even now looking back, like I can't imagine it.
So when did you first come across Tommy Robinson, and how did you sort of fall into his orbit?
I Googled his name, and there was a bunch of like negative news articles saying that he was like far right, like EDL founder, like this and this and this. But I had at this point believed that like the media wasn't to be trusted, and anyone who's working class and labeled far right is just like a sensible person. But I was still kind of scared to meet him. I remember like it was the first time I hadn't worn makeup, and like I remember he turned up at my front door on the King's Road, which is where I was living at the time, and he just seemed extremely sweet. He was extremely nice. I interviewed him for Rebel, and he loved the production value that I gave him. He was just genuinely lovely. Like, we went for lunch afterwards. We went for like fish and chips. And he was like, Kaylin, like, gay people are going to be killed in this country one day. Like, you're 100% right with all of this. Like, you're absolutely going down the right path. And I felt like safe with him. He was extremely charming and pretty cool.
You started to work very closely with him. I mean, for people, obviously, he's become such a sort of talismanic kind of figure. You know his mind. What does he want? Why has he ended up in the situation that he is in?
Well, I think when I first met Tommy, he was pretty much driven by ideology. Like, he had just got out of prison, the EDL had just been disbanded. He wanted to get online for the first time. He wanted to like utilize the internet, and he wanted to like spread his message. You know, he hated Islam, and he had a million reasons for that. But over time, we became extremely successful. Like, all the videos that we were doing for Rebel were blowing up beyond belief. And I guess he became in a new level of fame, hundreds of thousands of pounds. And it kind of just changed him. He sort of stopped believing in the stuff that he did originally, and basically became obsessed with cash and travel. He started becoming obsessed with the idea of going to the US and becoming an asylum seeker and like making a new life there. Yeah, like he basically from the beginning wanted to escape the UK, cause as much chaos as possible, which is literally what we're seeing now, and become like a refugee in the US so that he could live like a luxury life there. I remember him talking about it endlessly.
Why do you think he wants to cause chaos?
I think deep down it's just something that excites him. I feel like his life is a mess. He's always been a mess, and he also thrives in chaos. I feel like he also gets a huge amount of attention and followers from the UK being a disaster, right? His core would always be about undermining the UK and making the UK look like a mess and look unhinged. And I feel like he doesn't even really know what he wants.
Do you think that at this point it's largely about money and fame? It isn't about belief?
It mainly became about his profile, how much money he was making, how much fame he was getting. It basically just became totally money obsessed.
I mean, he's been fanning the flames of things here, obviously, in the course of the last week. He's got a huge reach now. But he's doing that, you think, mainly to aggrandize himself, to enhance his profile. It's not that he really believes or cares in anything anymore.
The things that he's tweeting from his Sun Lounger is exactly the same stuff that he romanticized and fantasized about doing years ago. It was fleeing the UK, being somewhere where he's comfortable. Ideally, it was always him being in the US, but he can't do that now because he has a criminal record. And just causing as much chaos as possible. And I remember we were in the car a few years ago when he got banned from Twitter. I can't remember exactly what the tweet was, but I remember him saying, like, I've been suspended, this and this and this. He was growing at an exponential rate, absolutely taking over. I think he went from 60 to 250,000 followers in the sake of a few weeks. And I remember thinking if he had carried on tweeting what he was tweeting and like pushing what he was pushing, he would have become a extremely influential force within a few months. As soon as Elon took over Twitter and reinstated him, and also allowed his name to be searched really easily and amplified all of his tweets and pushed all of his tweets, he's basically got his wish. He's about to hit 1 million followers, and he's about to become a huge force in UK politics.
Do you think so? I mean, how dangerous do you think he is to British politics and to Britain?
Somebody that is tweeting the things that he's tweeting, he doesn't believe half of it, but it doesn't matter because the truth is totally irrelevant to him, will genuinely disrupt normacy in the UK. The majority of people that have been protesting and rioting in the last few days who are far right have done so because they saw his tweets. What we saw with the riots in the last few days I genuinely think is just the beginning. Somebody that doesn't care about the truth and somebody that doesn't care about anything other than blowing up their own profile, regardless of what happens to Britain, is extremely dangerous.
So do you think that the British government and Western governments generally do need to do something about the fusion between someone like Robinson, the politics he represents, and the ideology and philosophy of Elon Musk, and i.e. do something about social media companies, or do you think it's not possible?
Oh, I don't think it's possible. I mean, we get all of our information from our news feeds now, right? The average person in Britain consumes 300 foot of news feed every day. If you printed it out, it'd be the length of a football stadium. That's literally where we get our information from. And if you got rid of that, then you get rid of also the good information that we're getting. You get rid of your show, everything. So I don't think that's possible or a good outcome. Things were much better when Tommy was banned from social media because we had social cohesion. We also had a situation where our news feeds were still pretty much curated when X was before Musk by verified sources. Now it's basically a free-for-all of misinformation. There's nothing the UK government can do. They are totally ill-equipped to deal with this. I don't think that Keir Starmer knows what is ahead. I don't think he knows even what he's dealing with. It is going to be a complete disaster. I mean, Tommy organized some of the largest right-wing rallies we've seen in British history in the last few months, but it's still just the beginning, and he's still growing by hundreds of thousands of followers, and it's still specifically because of his tweets. So it's going to be extremely tough times ahead.
Do you think that there will be versions of you, in a way, that have been brought under the kind of spell of the far right in the last week or so, who will have been interested in what they've seen and will start going down that rabbit hole as you've done?
The average person scrolls across Tommy Robinson's tweets. He's verified. He's got the blue tick. They might see a tweet that he posts talking about, immigrants taking over the UK or whatever it is, and they'll probably start coming around to it. I actually still get recognized in the street whenever I'm in King's Cross Station or in different parts of London or the UK by people who have seen my old Rebel videos and are still like, oh my God, I love your content, you're such a hero. And I try to tell them as much as possible that it's nonsense and to stop watching it. But all of it's still growing. And there's literally nothing to counter it.
Obviously, what is particularly interesting and germane about your story is the fact that you emerged from the rabbit hole and that you no longer believe those things and that you left, as you yourself described it, a cult. What started that process? How did it happen? And can it be replicated?
I'm pretty pessimistic about it, really. I mean, my de-radicalization happened because I was filming a documentary with Lauren Southern, who's a right-wing commentator from Canada. We flew to Turkey and we were filming with refugees crossing the Syrian border and then going from jumping points to the Aegean Islands in Greece. And I was convinced after years of misinformation that the people that we would encounter would be fighting age, furious, angry young men ready to, take over Europe. I remember we turned on the headlights one night when we heard some rustling in the bushes, and it was filled with women and children, and young men as well, but young men who I asked why they were leaving Turkey and why they were coming to Europe, and they were like, because our countries have been destroyed, because we have nowhere else to go, because in Turkey it's a disaster as well. They're putting us in camps. And having spent a night with them and waiting for the boats to arrive to take them to Europe for the first time ever, I was super nervous about us being arrested and them being arrested, and having this shared terror with them, and realizing that I guess I hope they made it and they weren't the horrible people that I imagined them to be. But it took me literally going across the world to see that refugees weren't monsters that were portrayed on my news feeds, to start stepping back. And most people don't have that opportunity, and most people don't have a position where they can actually experience those things. So I'm pretty pessimistic about it. And as we spend more time online and more time getting all of our information from our news feeds and literally all of our worldviews from our news feeds, I feel like it's going to only get worse. I realized I was wrong because I went into the real world and saw that it was nonsense, saw that the stuff that I was reading was nonsense. But most people can't do that.
That presumably must also have been quite traumatic in the same way that losing your initial kind of social grouping because you were going down the rabbit hole was traumatic, because you had made a whole new group of social connection. This was your world, right? So it must have been difficult purely on a social level to leave it.
Yeah, it really was. I remember texting Alex Jones and like Tommy and everyone that I worked with saying that all of it was nonsense and bullshit. And they called me a traitor, and they said that I was a government spy, and they like behaved like a complete cult. I started posting online about the experience that I had and about realizing that the world is more complicated than it seems, and realizing that actually the solutions that the hard right offer about everything being black and white and good versus evil is more complicated. And having so many people reach out and be like, I've had the same experience. I was in the Proud Boys. I was in the hard right. I was a Tommy follower, and I had the same thing. And I felt like I could do some good by talking about it.
Are there any kind of remnants of that thinking left with inside you, do you think? Because you say you were so deep in it and you were so part of it. It must be hard to fully, and maybe you don't even want to a complete extent, but it must be hard to fully sort of extricate yourself even mentally from it. I mean, do you still, like when you've seen what you've seen this week and you see these people, some of these people on the streets, is there part of you that sort of understands why they're there?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a sense of desperation in the UK. I mean, I remember when I went to Sunderland with Tommy a few years ago to do a campaign because it was called Justice for Chelsea. There was a rape victim that apparently had been groomed by Muslims, and the whole town had come together to support her. And I remember seeing this woman who looked very frail, who looked really desperate, walking up to me, and she gave me like a £5 note. And she was like, I couldn't donate online. I don't have a proper internet connection, but I just wanted to give you this to support your work. And I realized that there's like a huge number of people in the UK who are completely isolated, completely separate from the political system, who are completely let down by everybody. And I don't think that those people are evil or bad or there's anything wrong with them. I feel like some of their issues are also valid. Like when the Orlando shooting happened, again, 50 gay people killed by an Islamist, there weren't news reports talking about Islam or the Quran. There weren't. In the same way that when Christchurch happened, which is where 50 Muslims were killed by a far-right terrorist, we talked endlessly about far-right ideology. There wasn't the same scrutiny, and I feel like the media still kind of failed in addressing a lot of the issues that working class people and just normal, regular people like feel very close to home. So yeah, I sympathize still in a lot of ways. I feel like I didn't go from the right to the left. I just realized that the people I was working with and the questions that I had were valid, but the answers were wrong.
With your insight, if we had to understand one thing about these people and who they are, what should we understand? What should we think of?
It all comes down to money. Like whenever anyone recognizes me in the street and says, keep up the good work or likes Tommy, I always tell them that it's nonsense and to stop watching it. And the main issue is there is a well-funded, well-oiled, very, very, very successful system that works extremely well. And they make loads of money from what they put out. And if you follow the tracks of money and if you follow the revenue and if you look at how they're benefiting from us being misinformed, then I feel like that's a good start.
Kylan, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. Well, I found that fascinating and a really rare insight into the mind or mindlessness of the far right, how they think. And there can be no doubt that their ideas specifically about the incompatibility of races or particular religions living in Britain, and let's be honest, we're talking about Islam here, has become more normalised. And really, it's our quote-unquote mainstream politicians and media who sometimes have done that more than the far right themselves. Too often in recent years, politicians have been perhaps too scared to be seen to defend the liberal order. A multi-ethnic Britain with pockets of problems actually works quite well. As long as there isn't a clear opposition, these ideas will continue to grow, and with them, their extremist progenitors. Well, on that cheery note, it is bye from us for this week. Remember, you can send us story tips, feedback and questions on any subject, keep it clean, actually don't, for our Q&A special episodes to newsagents@global.com. That is newsagents@global.com. No John or Emily this Friday, unfortunately. Emily had to go down to Marseille at the very last minute, because you may have seen that John unfortunately came last in the kite surfing after 4 years of hard training. Not for the first time, the wind just wasn't in his sails. Anyway, she's gone to drown his sorrows with him over a nice bottle of Chablis. John, Los Angeles 2028 is just around the corner. Thanks to our production team on the News Agents: Natalie Inge, Zainal Uj, Rory Simon, Georgia Foxwell, Arvin Badwell, Shane Fennelly, Michaela Walters and Gabriel Radis. Our editor is Tom Hughes. It's presented by me, Emily Maitlis and John Sopel. We will see you on Monday. Have a lovely, sunny weekend.
The News Agents. This is a Global Player original podcast.